The evening sun was setting over Charleston's historic streets as Lieutenant General Robert Wilson drove his black Range Rover through the familiar neighborhoods of his hometown. After 3 decades of service and countless deployments, being back felt both strange and comforting. His 3-star uniform hung neatly in the back seat, pressed and ready for tomorrow's military ceremony where he would be speaking to new recruits about service, dedication, and the American dream. The general had just finished having dinner with his mother, who still lived in the modest house where he grew up. She'd cooked his favorite meal, her famous fried chicken and sweet potato pie, and spent hours sharing old photos and memories. Now, as he navigated the quiet streets of the upscale Hampton Heights neighborhood where he'd recently bought a house, his mind wandered to the speech he would give tomorrow. Wilson had achieved what many thought impossible, rising from humble beginnings to become one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army. His journey hadn't been easy, but his mother had always taught him to meet challenges with dignity and determination. He'd graduated top of his class at West Point, led troops in combat operations across 3 continents, and earned multiple distinguished service medals. His current position had him overseeing strategic operations that helped shape national defense policy. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on as he turned onto Maple Avenue. The rows of grand old houses with their wraparound porches reminded him of how far he'd come from the small rental house where he grew up on the other side of town. He'd chosen this neighborhood not just for its beauty, but because it represented something important, the fact that in America, dedication and hard work could open doors that once seemed firmly closed. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, a second-year medical student. "Good luck tomorrow, Dad. Wish I could be there." He smiled, thinking about how proud she made him. She was carrying forward his family's tradition of service, though in her own unique way. As Wilson slowed down to turn into his driveway, he noticed a police cruiser that had been following him for the past few blocks. He didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols were common in this neighborhood. But then the cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the evening in harsh blues and reds. The general felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, one that decades of military service and authority couldn't quite erase. He'd had this conversation with his father years ago, and later with his own son. When you get pulled over, stay calm, move slowly, keep your hands visible. Even with 3 stars on his uniform, even after all these years, those lessons remained deeply ingrained. He pulled over carefully, positioning his car so the patrol car's dash camera would have a clear view. As he reached for his registration in the glove compartment, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines around his eyes showed his years of service, and a few gray hairs had started appearing at his temples. In that moment, he thought about all the young soldiers who would be watching him speak tomorrow about honor, duty, and the power of perseverance. Little did he know, the next few minutes would test those principles in ways he hadn't expected. As he watched the police officer approach in his side mirror, Wilson took a deep breath, keeping his hands firmly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. 30 years of military service had taught him to read situations quickly, and something in the officer's approaching stance told him this routine traffic stop might become anything but routine. Officer David Reed had been on the force for 8 years, and something about the Range Rover didn't sit right with him. He'd been working this upscale beat for the past 3 months, and he prided himself on knowing who belonged and who didn't. The vehicle itself wasn't out of place. Plenty of expensive cars rolled through Hampton Heights. But something about the driver made him suspicious, though if asked, he couldn't quite explain why. Reed switched on his body camera as he stepped out of his patrol car, leaving his hat behind, something he'd been written up for twice before. His hand rested on his weapon as he approached the Range Rover, flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. The interior lights were on, showing a single occupant sitting perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Reed barked, his flashlight beam intentionally angling toward the driver's eyes. He noticed the military uniform hanging in the back seat, but dismissed it. Anyone could buy those at an army surplus store, he thought to himself. "Good evening, officer," the general replied calmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my ID is in my wallet. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Reed's response came sharp and quick. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Why are you in this neighborhood?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Through the window, Wilson could see the officer's nameplate catching the streetlight. He thought about all the times he'd addressed troops about maintaining composure under pressure. Now it was his turn to practice what he preached. "Officer Reed, I live at 1242 Maple Avenue just there." He nodded slightly toward his house, careful to keep his movements minimal. "I'm a lieutenant general in the United States Army, and my ID will confirm that." Reed's flashlight beam swept across the house, then back to Wilson's face. His jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his free hand moving to unclasp his holster. Wilson's mind raced through his options. He knew his rights, knew he could refuse without probable cause. But 30 years of military experience had taught him that sometimes the smartest tactical decision was to de-escalate, even when you held the moral high ground. "I'll step out, officer," Wilson said evenly, "but I want to be clear that I'm complying under protest. I've given you no reason for this escalation." He kept his movements deliberate and smooth as he reached for the door handle. As Wilson emerged from the vehicle, Reed immediately grabbed his arm, spinning him around to face the car. The general's shoulder hit the window with enough force to make him wince. Despite his instinct to resist, Wilson forced himself to stay calm, even as he felt cold metal closing around his wrists. "This is completely unnecessary," Wilson stated, his voice still steady despite the situation. "My military ID is in my back pocket, along with my driver's license. I'm a 3-star general, and tomorrow I'm giving a speech at—" "Stop resisting," Reed interrupted, though Wilson hadn't moved a muscle. The handcuffs clicked tighter. Just then, headlights swept across the scene as another car approached. Wilson recognized the military plates. It was a base vehicle. The car slowed, then pulled over. A young officer stepped out, phone already raised. "Sir," the young officer called out, recognition clear in his voice. "General Wilson, is everything all right?" Reed's grip on Wilson's arm tightened as he realized this might be more complicated than he'd thought. The young officer was already making a call, speaking quickly into his phone about witnessing a situation requiring immediate attention. More cars were starting to slow down now. Phones appeared in windows and doorways of nearby houses. The quiet evening had suddenly become very public, and Officer Reed was beginning to realize he might have made a serious miscalculation. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the next few minutes would change not just Reed's career, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the peaceful streets of Hampton Heights. The young officer's phone was still recording, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming a viral incident that would force America to once again confront some uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the long road to real change. The young officer who had stopped his car was Lieutenant Chen, fresh from his 3rd year of service. His hands trembled slightly as he continued recording, knowing the weight of what he was witnessing. As an Asian American officer who had faced his own share of prejudice, he understood the significance of this moment all too well. "Sir, I'm from Fort Jackson," Chen called out clearly, making sure his voice would be picked up by his phone's microphone. "I attended your leadership seminar last month. General Wilson is scheduled to speak at tomorrow's ceremony." Officer Reed's face began to pale as the reality of the situation sank in. More cars were stopping now, and he could hear the distinct sound of news helicopters approaching in the distance. A group of neighbors had gathered on their porches, many with phones raised, capturing every second of the unfolding scene. "Officer," Wilson spoke calmly, despite the discomfort of the handcuffs, "I understand you're doing your job, but this has gone far enough. My military ID is in my back pocket, as I mentioned earlier. I suggest you verify my identity now, before this situation becomes even more complicated than it already is." Reed's training kicked in, and he knew he needed to make a decision fast. With slightly shaky hands, he reached for Wilson's back pocket and removed the wallet. As he flipped it open, his heart sank. There it was, a military ID with 3 stars clearly visible, along with a Department of Defense identification card that confirmed everything the general had been saying. The sound of sirens filled the air as 2 more police cars pulled up, followed closely by an unmarked vehicle. A tall man in a suit stepped out, Deputy Chief Richards, who had been alerted by dispatch after multiple 911 calls from concerned neighbors. "What in God's name is going on here?" Richards demanded, taking in the scene before him. His eyes widened as he recognized Wilson from a recent military cooperation ceremony at City Hall. "Get those cuffs off him right now," Richards ordered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made Reed fumble with his keys. As the handcuffs came off, Wilson rolled his shoulders slowly, working out the stiffness. News vans were beginning to arrive, their bright lights illuminating the street like it was daytime. Wilson could see his phone lighting up in the car. No doubt his staff had already been alerted. Tomorrow's ceremony would now carry a very different meaning. A female reporter approached, microphone in hand, but Deputy Chief Richards stepped in front of the cameras. "The Charleston Police Department deeply regrets this incident," he began, but Wilson gently interrupted him. "If I may," the general said, straightening his civilian clothes with dignity. The gathered crowd fell silent, phones still recording. Here was a moment that could go in many different directions, and everyone knew it. "What happened here tonight is unfortunate," Wilson began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when addressing his troops, "but it's also an opportunity. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to talk to young recruits about service, honor, and the American dream. Now I can tell them something even more important, about how we handle adversity, about the power of keeping our composure when faced with injustice, and about how we can turn difficult moments into chances for positive change." The crowd had grown larger, and Wilson could see people nodding. Even Officer Reed, who stood to the side looking thoroughly chastened, seemed to be listening intently. "I've served this country for 30 years, Wilson continued, leading troops from every background imaginable. "What makes our military strong is not that we're perfect, we're not. What makes us strong is our ability to acknowledge our mistakes, learn from them, and do better. I believe our police forces can do the same." Deputy Chief Richards stepped forward again, this time with a different energy. "General Wilson, on behalf of the department, I want to publicly apologize. What happened here is unacceptable, and there will be a full investigation. But more than that, I'd like to invite you to help us make real changes in our training programs." The news helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights creating dramatic shadows on the faces of everyone gathered. But something else was happening too. People from different houses, different backgrounds were talking to each other, sharing their own stories, exchanging numbers. What had started as a moment of injustice was transforming, right there on Maple Avenue, into something that felt like the beginning of change. By midnight, the video of the incident had spread across social media like wildfire. Lieutenant Chen's footage, along with recordings from neighbors, painted a clear picture of what had transpired. The hashtag General Wilson was trending nationwide, and news channels were running the story on repeat. Inside the Charleston Police Department headquarters, Deputy Chief Richards sat in his office, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. Multiple screens showed different news channels covering the story, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing. He just finished a call with the mayor, who was cutting short his business trip to address the situation. Meanwhile, in the quiet of his home study, General Wilson sat at his desk, rewriting his speech for tomorrow's ceremony. His daughter had called in tears after seeing the video, but he'd reassured her he was okay. "Sometimes," he told her, "the most important lessons come from our hardest moments." The general's phone lit up with a message from his old friend, a retired judge who'd mentored him early in his career. "I saw what happened. How are you holding up?" The message read. Wilson smiled, remembering all the conversations they'd had about creating change from within the system. As dawn approached, Officer Reed sat in the department's internal affairs office, watching his own body camera footage for the third time. Each viewing made his actions harder to justify. The department psychologist sat with him, taking notes as Reed finally began to open up about his unconscious biases and the pressures he felt on the job. The morning news shows were in full swing when General Wilson arrived at Fort Jackson for the ceremony. The crowd was larger than expected. Word had spread about what happened, and many people had come specifically to show their support. Among them were several of the neighbors who'd witnessed the incident, wearing their Sunday best. As Wilson took the stage, he noticed something unexpected. In the back of the crowd stood Officer Reed, out of uniform, accompanied by Deputy Chief Richards. They hadn't been invited, but their presence spoke volumes about their willingness to face the situation head-on. "Good morning," Wilson began, his voice carrying across the hushed audience. "I had a different speech prepared for today. But last night, something happened that changed not just my speech, but my understanding of what it means to serve." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, young recruits, seasoned officers, community members, and even a few national press reporters who'd managed to get clearance to attend. In the military, we have a saying, "Pressure doesn't build character, it reveals it." Last night, many people were put under pressure. Some made mistakes. Others showed extraordinary courage. He nodded toward Lieutenant Chen, who sat with his unit, still somewhat amazed at how his quick thinking had impacted events. But what matters most isn't the pressure or even the mistakes, it's what we do next. This morning, I received a call from the police academy. They've asked me to help develop a new training program focused on community relations and bias awareness. I've accepted. A murmur ran through the crowd. Wilson could see Officer Reed's head lift slightly. "You see, when I look at our young recruits here today, I see the future of our armed forces, and when I look at our police officers," he gestured toward Reed and Richards, "I see people who've chosen to serve their community, just like us. We all took oaths to protect and defend. Sometimes that means defending against our own preconceptions and fears." Wilson shared how his own journey hadn't been easy, the obstacles he'd faced, the mentors who'd guided him, the lessons he'd learned. He spoke about the importance of accountability, but also about the power of transformation and the courage it takes to admit when we're wrong. As he spoke, something remarkable was happening in the audience. People who'd come angry were listening thoughtfully. Officers who'd arrived defensive were nodding in understanding. The recruits, who would shape the future of the military, were witnessing a masterclass in leadership and grace under pressure. Deputy Chief Richards leaned over to whisper to Officer Reed, "This is what real leadership looks like. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about how we handle them and what we learn from them." The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the parade ground. News cameras captured every word, but they also captured something else, the image of a community coming together to face hard truths and work toward real solutions. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was perhaps the beginning of something even more important. In the weeks following the incident, the ripple effects spread far beyond Charleston. The video had sparked nationwide discussions about policing, respect, and the possibility of positive change. But unlike many viral incidents that flared up and faded away, this one was different, largely because of how both sides chose to handle it. The Charleston Police Department faced intense scrutiny. Internal Affairs had completed their investigation, revealing that Officer Reed had a history of complaints about similar stops. But rather than simply firing him, something unexpected happened. Deputy Chief Richards, inspired by General Wilson's approach, proposed a different solution. "We're not just going to terminate Officer Reed," Richards announced at a packed press conference. "That's the easy way out. Instead, we're going to use this as a catalyst for department-wide change, and Officer Reed has agreed to be part of that process." Reed himself stood at the podium, visibly nervous but determined. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But more than that, I've come to realize I had biases I didn't even know about. The easy thing would be to walk away in shame. The right thing is to stay and help fix the problem." The department unveiled a comprehensive new training program developed with input from General Wilson and civil rights leaders. Every officer would undergo enhanced bias awareness training, but more importantly, they would participate in community engagement programs designed to break down barriers and build real relationships. Meanwhile, at Fort Jackson, General Wilson's speech had taken on a life of its own. Video clips had gone viral, not just of the incident, but of his response to it. Military bases across the country were requesting copies to use in their own training programs. The Pentagon had taken notice, seeing an opportunity to strengthen military-police relations nationwide. Lieutenant Chen, whose quick thinking had captured the crucial footage, found himself invited to speak at police academies about the importance of moral courage and doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. His story resonated particularly with young officers from minority backgrounds. But perhaps the most surprising development came from the Hampton Heights neighborhood itself. The incident had brought neighbors together who had barely spoken before. Weekly community meetings, which used to draw only a handful of people, were now packed with residents wanting to discuss how to make their community more inclusive. One evening, about a month after the incident, General Wilson hosted a neighborhood barbecue in his front yard, right where the confrontation had happened. The smell of grilled burgers and the sound of children playing filled the air where tension had once crackled. Officer Reed was there, out of uniform, helping to serve food and engaging in honest conversations with residents. "It's not easy," Reed admitted to a group of neighbors. "Every day, I have to confront things about myself I didn't want to see. But I'm learning, and that's what matters." An elderly resident patted his shoulder, sharing her own story of growth and change over the decades. The local news covered the barbecue, but what caught people's attention wasn't the event itself, it was the natural way people from different backgrounds were interacting. The barriers that had seemed so solid just weeks ago were starting to crack. General Wilson stood on his porch, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. His daughter had come home for the weekend and was deep in conversation with Lieutenant Chen and some of the younger residents about their experiences and hopes for the future. "You know," Deputy Chief Richards said, joining Wilson on the porch, "when I first got the call that night, I thought this would be the biggest crisis of my career. Instead, it's turning into our biggest opportunity for real change." Wilson nodded, thinking about all the young soldiers he'd trained over the years. Sometimes the best training doesn't come from a manual or a classroom. It comes from facing our mistakes honestly and doing the hard work to make things right. As the sun set over Hampton Heights, the conversations continued, honest, sometimes difficult, but always respectful. Children played tag on the lawn where police cars had once parked with flashing lights. The local ice cream truck even stopped by, its cheerful music a stark contrast to the sirens that had filled the air that night. This wasn't just a story about one incident anymore. It had become a story about how a community chose to respond to a challenge, not with anger and division, but with openness to change and a willingness to do the hard work of making things better. 6 months after the incident, the changes that started in Charleston had spread far beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a tense confrontation on a quiet street had sparked a movement of positive change across police departments nationwide. On a crisp autumn morning, General Wilson stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a room full of police chiefs and military leaders from across the country. The program he'd helped develop in Charleston had caught the attention of the highest levels of government, and now he was here to share their success story. "When I was handcuffed that night," he began, his voice carrying through the packed auditorium, "I had two choices. I could let anger take over, or I could see it as an opportunity for change. What made the difference was that the police department made the same choice." In the audience, Officer Reed sat next to Deputy Chief Richards, both now regular speakers at police training academies. Reed had become an unexpected voice for change, sharing his story with brutal honesty that resonated with officers across the country. "The hardest part," Reed would tell them, "wasn't admitting I made a mistake, it was admitting why I made it. But once I faced those truths about myself, I could help others face them too." Back in Charleston, the changes were visible in ways big and small. The police department had completely revamped its training program, making community engagement a core part of every officer's duty. New officers now spent their first month working with community organizations, getting to know the people they'd be serving before they ever put on a uniform. Lieutenant Chen had been promoted to captain, heading up a new division focused on community relations and officer accountability. His office walls were covered with thank you letters from young officers who'd found the courage to speak up when they saw something wrong. The Hampton Heights neighborhood had transformed too. The community meetings that started after the incident had grown into a monthly festival where residents from all parts of town came together to share food, stories, and ideas for making their city better. The ice cream truck driver who'd shown up at that first barbecue now had a regular route through neighborhoods he'd once avoided. One day, General Wilson received a letter from a young police cadet in Minnesota. "I saw the video of what happened to you," the cadet wrote, "but more importantly, I saw what you did with it. It changed how I think about my future role as an officer." The letter joined hundreds of others in a scrapbook Wilson's daughter had started keeping. She'd taken a break from medical school to help coordinate the expanding training program, saying her father had shown her that healing communities was just as important as healing bodies. The media coverage had evolved too. Instead of just replaying the confrontation video, news outlets were now following the positive changes happening in Charleston and other cities adopting similar programs. A documentary filmmaker was working on a feature about the ripple effects of that night, interviewing everyone from the neighbors who'd recorded the incident to police chiefs implementing the new training methods. At a National Police Chiefs Conference, Deputy Chief Richards shared their latest statistics. Complaints about officer conduct had dropped by 60%, while positive community feedback had tripled. Other departments were reporting similar results after implementing the program. But it's not just about the numbers, Richards explained. It's about the conversations happening in break rooms and patrol cars. Officers are talking openly about their fears and biases, asking for help when they need it, and looking out for each other in new ways. Officer Reed, now a training coordinator, had started a support group for officers struggling with similar issues he'd faced. "We can't be afraid to look in the mirror," he'd tell them. "That's where real change begins." The changes weren't limited to police departments either. Military bases across the country had incorporated lessons from the incident into their leadership training. General Wilson's message about turning confrontation into conversation had become part of the curriculum at service academies. One evening, as Wilson drove home through Hampton Heights, he passed Officer Reed giving a community presentation at the local library. Through the windows, he could see a diverse crowd engaged in animated discussion. Children played safely on the street outside, watched over by neighbors who now knew each other by name. He pulled into his driveway, thinking about how different things might have been if everyone had made different choices that night. The porch light was on, welcoming him home. The same light that had illuminated a scene of tension 6 months ago now symbolized how far they'd come. 1 year after that fateful night on Maple Avenue, General Wilson stood in the White House Rose Garden. The president had just signed an executive order implementing nationwide police training reforms, largely based on the program that had started in Charleston. But Wilson wasn't thinking about the politics or the press coverage. His mind was on the real stories of change he'd witnessed over the past year. Earlier that morning, he received a video call from Officer Reed, who was now teaching at the police academy. "You won't believe what happened yesterday," Reed had said, his face bright with excitement. He went on to describe how a cadet had stopped a training scenario midway to point out potential bias in the approach. "A year ago, everyone would have stayed quiet. Now they're speaking up before problems happen." The changes in Charleston had exceeded everyone's expectations. The police department had become a national model for community engagement. Officers now regularly attended neighborhood events, not as security, but as participants. They knew the names of the kids on their beats, the local shop owners, the elderly residents who needed extra help. Lieutenant Chen, now Captain Chen, had started a mentorship program pairing experienced officers with community youth. The program had already helped several young people choose careers in public service, including some who'd decided to become police officers themselves. "When I recorded that video," Chen had said at a recent graduation ceremony, "I was just doing what I thought was right. I never imagined it would lead to all this." The Hampton Heights neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The community meetings had evolved into a neighborhood council that worked directly with the police department on safety and community initiatives. The ice cream truck driver who'd shown up at that first barbecue had been elected as council president, proving that leadership could come from unexpected places. Deputy Chief Richards, now Chief Richards, had made the Charleston model famous at law enforcement conferences across the country. "It's not just about avoiding mistakes," he would say. "It's about building relationships before incidents happen. It's about seeing each other as people first." One of the most powerful moments of the year had come when Officer Reed and General Wilson were invited to speak together at the FBI Academy. They shared the stage, telling their story from both perspectives, showing how one incident handled with honesty and grace could change countless lives. "I could have lost my job that night," Reed told the audience. "Instead, I found my true calling. Now I help other officers face their biases before they make the same mistakes I did." Wilson's daughter had finished medical school and chosen to do her residency at a Charleston hospital, saying the city's transformation had shown her the healing power of community. She'd started a program bringing together healthcare workers and law enforcement to better serve vulnerable populations. The documentary about Charleston's changes had won several awards and was being shown in police academies and military bases nationwide. But more importantly, it had sparked similar initiatives in cities across the country. The filmmaker had captured something rare, a story where everyone chose to be their best selves in the aftermath of a potential tragedy. As Wilson stood in the Rose Garden that day, he thought about all the lives touched by what happened that night. The young officers who'd found the courage to speak up, the community members who'd learned to trust again, the leaders who'd chosen accountability over defensiveness. A group of police cadets had been invited to the signing ceremony. Among them was a young officer from Charleston, the son of one of Wilson's neighbors who'd witnessed the original incident. The young man had changed his career plans after that night, saying he wanted to be part of the solution. After the ceremony, Wilson took a moment to call his mother. She still lived in that modest house where he'd grown up, but now the police officers who patrolled her street knew her by name and often stopped to check on her. "You know," she told him, "your father would be proud, not just of what you've achieved, but of how you achieved it." That evening, back in Charleston, the community held a celebration in the park. Officer Reed was there, playing basketball with local kids. Captain Chen was grilling hot dogs. Chief Richards was chatting with residents about their latest community initiatives. The ice cream truck played its cheerful tune as children lined up, their parents chatting comfortably with the officers on duty. Wilson watched it all from a bench, thinking about how far they'd come. A young reporter approached, asking what he thought his legacy would be. "This isn't my legacy," he replied, gesturing to the scene around them. "This belongs to everyone who chose to be part of the solution. Real change doesn't come from one person or one incident. It comes from thousands of people making better choices every day." As the sun set over Charleston, the park was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and friendly conversation. The police cars parked nearby had their lights off. They weren't there to respond to trouble, but to be part of the community. And that, perhaps, was the biggest change of all.